Hi, I'm Joey from Fanatik Bike Co, and today we're going to walk you through putting together your custom mountain bike. It probably arrived in a box that looks something like this, and I'm sure you're pretty stoked. But before you reach for that Red Bull, I'm going to walk you through a few steps that's going to make this process as smooth as possible. Of course, make sure you have all the proper tools so the bike goes together in the correct manner. Once you've opened your box, remove your fork and wheels and set them aside. Now that we have the frame out of the box, we're going to start removing everything. There's going to be a box that contains your handlebars, your grips, your saddle, chain, and possibly a few other small parts. We don't need that right now, so we're just going to set that aside. Next, use the cable cutters to cut the zip ties holding the frame to the cardboard insert. Careful, of course, not to cut any hydraulic hoses. Once you've cut all the cable ties and removed all the packaging from the frame and the components, you're going to raise your dropper post, if you have included one on your custom build, and put the frame in your repair stand, being sure not to clamp too tight on the shaft. You just need it tight enough to hold the frame in place. Next, we're going to start by putting the fork into the frame. You're going to see that there are multiple components to the headset. You're going to want to make sure those go in the same orientation that they come off your steer tube. It's always a good idea to take the pieces off the steer tube in the reverse order and set them down as such, so when you go back to put them in, you know what orientation they were meant to be in. The mechanic who built your bike put a thin layer of grease on your headset cups and your headset bearings, but it's a good idea to put another little thin film on there, something like Dumont, Philwood, or Park Polylube. Make sure when assembling your headset that the bevel that's on the bearing matches up with the bevel on the headset cup. Put the top bearing in. The bottom bearing is going to have that bevel facing up because it's going to sit against the bevel in the bottom headset cup. I'm going to slide that on there. Next, you're going to slide the steer tube into your frame. Next, the top cap's going to go on. Just make sure that's nice and snug. You're going to see a whole bunch of headset spacers. There's going to be a proper orientation to these based on how you want your ride height to be. Put a bunch below. Put my stem and bars on. Spacers on top of the stem, followed by the top cap. The top cap is the preload for the headset bearings. We don't need to set that exactly to spec right now. We'll get to that later. Now we can start putting the components on your handlebars. Shifters, brake levers, dropper post levers, and the like. Once you have all of your levers installed, just snug them down so they don't move while you're making adjustments, but be aware you're going to make some final adjustments to them before your first ride. Next, we're going to put the rear derailleur and rear wheel on the bike. When installing your rear derailleur, make sure there is a thin film of grease on the threads. This SRAM derailleur has a cage lock, which we're going to use to make the installation easier. On Shimano derailleurs, there is an on-off switch for the clutch. Switch that to off. This specific SRAM rear derailleur uses a 5mm Allen wrench. Some, however, use a Torx 25. Make sure you're using the proper tool. You want to also make sure the shoulder on the rear derailleur matches up with the lip on your derailleur hanger. Snug that down tightly to about 10 or 12 Newton meters. Before installing the rear wheel, make sure to remove the pad spacer from the rear disc brake. This frame uses a 5mm bolt-on through axle. Some, however, may use a quick release through axle. The axle should have a thin film of grease on it. If it does not, put that on now. Put the rear wheel under the frame. Make sure not to hit the rear derailleur. Line up the rotor inside of the pads. Slide the axle in and tighten it down to spec. Just like the rear wheel, you're going to have to remove the pad spacer from in between the pads of your disc brake. This bike has a quick release front axle, so you're going to open that up and, just like before, apply a thin film of grease if one is not on your axle. Now that your bike is starting to look like a bike, it's time to install the chain. Inside of this plastic bag will be your chain and a quick link, either from SRAM or Shimano. This part can cause some people a lot of stress, so let's just take it slowly. I'm going to put the chain over the smallest cog on the cassette, over the chainstay, and around your chainring. Threading the chain over the top pulley wheel and back around the bottom one. Install the quick link with the arrow pointing towards the back of the bike. Pull it taut. Release the cage lock on your SRAM rear derailleur. Then pedal the bike until the quick link is on the top of the pedal stroke. Grab the rear wheel and pedal forwards until it snaps into place like so. A mechanic fully tuned your bike before it's packed for shipping. Go through your gears to make sure they're functioning properly. If they aren't functioning properly and you're not comfortable making the adjustments yourself, please give us a call or take the bike into your local bike shop. Now it's time to put your seat on the seat post. The easiest way to do that is to loosen both the bolts to the end of the threads. With the seat installed and the bike out of the repair stand, now we can adjust the level of the saddle by tightening and loosening these bolts here. Once it's level, make sure they're both tightened down, and you can adjust the fore and aft by adjusting those screws as well. With the back end of the bike taken care of, now we can set up the cockpit. We're going to adjust the roll of the handlebars, making sure it's not rolled too far back or too far forward, and that the grip area is mostly flat and level. First, we're going to loosen the bolts on the stem faceplate and get those in a position to our liking. We're going to get those tight enough to hold the bars in place, and then use a torque wrench to make sure these are torqued down to spec. You want to make sure you're using a torque wrench, especially if you have a carbon fiber handlebar. If you don't already have one, you can definitely order one off of our website with the link above. Next, we're going to set up the brake levers to make sure that they're equidistant from the grips. Also, we want to make sure that the angle of those levers are the same left and right. You want to get those set in your position of the liking, and then, as before, use a torque wrench to make sure that they're torqued down to spec. You don't want them too loose or too tight. With the cockpit area all set up, we're going to make sure that the stem is straight and that the headset is properly preloaded. I'm going to loosen the stem bolts and just make sure that your top cap bolt is tight. You rock it back and forth a little bit, make sure there's no movement. Putting a finger on the top cap of the headset is a good way to feel any play. If it doesn't feel like there's any play there and it moves freely from side to side, you're probably in a pretty good place. Looking down at the handlebars, you're going to want to line up the back of the bars with the front of the crown. Make sure that there's an even gap on both sides. Looks good, and it's time to torque that up as well. Now that we have the cockpit torqued down to spec, it's time to pump up the tires before heading out for a ride. Definitely want to pump those up to your preferred PSI as we ship the bikes with the tires partially deflated. So that just about does it for your new bike setup. Again, I'm Joey with Fanatik Bike Co. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. You can send us an email at sales@fanatikbike.com or give us a call at 1-844-FANATIC. That's 1-844-326-2845. Thanks and have a great day. Now go out and ride.